Let's continue looking at sort positions. Keep in mind what we just learned in the last movie about the scope of the positions, because you're going to need to apply that again here. But first we have another issue to solve. We can use our existing CRUD to edit the position of any one item, but we don't yet have any mechanism to reposition the other items up or down to make room for it, or to fill in the position that it used to occupy. What we need is some code that will help us to do that, and ideally to do it automatically in the background. And while moving those items around, we'll also want to be mindful about their scope, so that if we move the position of a page under a subject, we don't want to rearrange the position of every page, just the ones that are under that same subject. There's a popular plugin called ActsAsList that does this for you. We'll talk about plugins later. But instead of using that, we're going to create our own poor man's version of repositioning code. It won't be as fast or have as many features, but it will be a good example and use techniques that you already know. So let's ask ourselves, where should we put our repositioning code? We could put it in our controller, but then we'd have to repeat ourselves a lot. And it's really the kind of intelligence that we want our model to have. Our model should be intelligent enough to manage its positions. So that's where we're going to put it. We're going to put it in the model. But we're going to need to use it in 3 different models: subject, page, and section. Now we could just paste the code in 3 different times, but that's repeating ourselves. And again, we want to try to avoid that. The best way for us to share functionality between our models is by using modules. Modules are part of basic Ruby. They're not unique to Rails, and modules are wrappers around methods and other code that we can then include in our Ruby classes to add those methods to the class. So for example, if I have a module called positionMover, I would define it very much in the same way that we define a class. I would just say module and the name of the module, and then I would put definitions inside of it, just like we do in a class. The difference is that a module can't be instantiated. We can't have an instance of positionMover. It's just a wrapper of these methods waiting to be included in a class. So that's exactly what we do. In the second half there, you'll see class subject includes positionMover. That's the same thing as if we copied everything that's inside the module and pasted it inside subject. So now subject will have a method called moveToPosition. It's just simply loading in all of that definition and making it part of subject. And then we can do the same thing into page and section just as well. So we can define it in one place, but use it in several places. Now, in order for a module to be used and included in our classes, it needs to be loaded by Rails. So where do we locate our modules inside our application so that we make sure that Rails loads it and makes it available to us so we can include it in our classes? Well, any code that you put into your app helpers folder, your app models folder, or into your lib folder should get loaded automatically by Rails. Now I say should because there have been times in the past when the configuration about exactly what gets loaded into Rails has changed slightly. If it does change, it's just a configuration you have to set in the config folder inside the environment file. And you can just set there what gets loaded automatically. But as I'm recording this, helpers, models, and lib all do get loaded in automatically. Now, you could put this repositioning code in any of those 3 places. It's really up to you. For me, I like to keep the helpers reserved exclusively for my view helpers. Those view helpers actually are modules as well, but I make them modules that are related to my views. Now, the models would be an acceptable choice for it, but I'm going to opt to put it in my lib folder, mostly because I can see how I might want to reuse this code in other applications. And so I'm thinking of it as part of my personal library of code. Now, even though Rails should load it for you, it's also a good practice to require the file before including it to make sure it's loaded. I'll demonstrate that later. But first, let's begin by taking a look at the module and the moveToPosition method. So here I am in my simple CMS application. Inside the lib folder, you'll see I've already got positionmover.rb. I've added this file there. You can add it yourself. It's also in the exercise files for this chapter if you want to just pull it from there. Let me just scroll all the way up to the top here. There we go. PositionMover is a module to manage the position attribute of a model. Put it in the lib folder, include it in any class, just like we talked about. And I also mention again that this imitates the behavior of ActsAsList. So first we define the module positionMover, and then here's our method, moveToPosition. Now moveToPosition is going to move a list item to a new position, but it's also going to take care of incrementing and decrementing all the other items that it needs to as necessary to shift the list up or down to accommodate the move that we just made to that one item. Note here, if we send nil as the value for new position, it will remove the item from the list. So if we send moveToPosition nil, it pulls it out of the list and closes that hole. So if it was at position number 4, we take it out of the list. Now, what was it? Position number 5 moves up to position number 4. And what was it? Position number 6 moves up to number 5, and so on. Okay, so now let's take a look at the code that actually accomplishes this. Move to position. First thing we're going to do is find out what the maximum position is. What's the highest that we could go? So what we want to do is find out how many items in this scope are there, right? So if we're looking at pages, for example, under a subject, how many pages are there under a subject? That'll tell us the maximum position that we could have. So we're going to do a find here using where, and we're going to use position scope, which we'll talk about in just a moment, to help us to scope it to the right thing. Now, because we're using a module, we can't just simply say subject.where, right? This needs to be reusable. So instead, we're going to use self.class. So this instance, get its class, and tell that class to do the where. So that will allow us to include this in the subject class, the page class, and the section class. And wherever it's included, it'll get that class and call the where method on that class. That's an important piece of flexibility that we want to add when we're working with modules. And then, of course, after we actually do that find, then we can perform the count to find out how many items there are. The next step is we want to make sure that new position is in that range 1, 2, whatever the highest number is. Or it could be nil. So if it's not nil, then check and make sure that it's inside that range. And we do this nice little trick here where we say 1 or the new position, making sure to convert it to an integer, take the maximum value of that. So it'll make sure that the number is never lower than 1. Then take the result of that and put it in an array with the maximum position and take the minimum of that. So that'll always make sure that we take the smaller value. It'll never be above max position. This is a nice little Ruby trick that you can use to force a value to stay in between an upper and lower limit. So once we've done that, then we have to take a look at what are we trying to accomplish here? Well, if the current position is equal to the new position, well then do nothing. It's already in the right place. So we just return true. If the current position is nil, that means it's not in the list yet. So that means we need to create a space for it before we can put it into its new position. So we open up a space by calling increment items, and that will increment all the items starting at the new position going up to, and I just said 1 million. We'll take a look at increment items in a second. Now, if new position is nil, we want to remove it from the list. In that case, we want to decrement items, starting with the item right after this item, all the way up to 1 million, and shift those up. The next possibility is that new position that we want to move it to is a lower number than its current position. And if so, what we want to do is find all items that are between those 2 points and shift them up. So we'll simultaneously open a spot for it at the lower position while closing in the gap at the higher position. And then the reverse of that, if the new position is greater than the current position, then we want to shift the higher items down. And then last of all, once we've shifted the other items appropriately, then we can update the attribute by putting this item into that spot that we've opened up. All right, so now let's take a look at some of these helper methods. Notice that I've made them all private methods because we can't call them directly. The only thing we can call publicly is move to position. So only these classes themselves, once including this, will be able to use these methods. So the first one is position scope. It's going to be an SQL fragment that we're going to use for narrowing the scope. Let's go back up here and remind ourselves. It's going to be whatever we drop into the where clause to make sure that we find things that are in the right scope. So by default, position scope is just going to be 1 equals 1. That's always true. So that won't scope it at all. It'll always be true. It'll say basically find everything. Don't use any conditions. But what we can do is override this method in each of our classes if we want to have a different scope. And you can see I give an example of that here. We include the position. That ends up defining position scope. And then what we do is redefine it here with our new fragment, which will be whatever we want it to scope by. There are fancier ways that you can do this, but I think this provides a good example of how we can actually redefine methods that were defined inside the module if we want something different. Next, let's look at our increment items and decrement items. These are nice and simple. We take the class that we're currently in and find everything where the position meets the 2 criteria, first and last. Those are the values we're passing in. Everything that meets those criteria, well, go through each one of them and update its attribute by raising its position by 1. Decrement does the exact same thing in reverse. So we're going to find everything between the first and the last items that we want, and then go through each of them, updating their position -1. So again, most of this is just using basic Ruby and the techniques that we've learned in Rails before, and just putting them together so that we can create this position mover module. Okay, now that we have our position mover module and we understand how it works, Let's see how we can actually use it in our application in the next movie.